Well, today's daf is daf Zayin. We're going to start on daf Vav Hamid Beis, a little bit towards the bottom. We'll count up from the bottom. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 lines up from the bottom on Vav Hamid Beis, Lo Rabbi Yossi. And the Gemara rejects the previous answer in which we had explained the opinion of Tana Debei Rabbi Shmuel as reflecting the Shita of Rabbi Nosson, that if you violate Havara on Shabbos, Rabbi Nosson holds Yechayev Kares. Now the Gemara is saying, no, let's reinterpret Tana Debei Rabbi Shmuel according to Rabbi Yossi, who holds that lighting a fire on Shabbos is only a lav. That's called Havara Lelav Yotzes. There's no Kares, there's no Skila. And therefore the pasuk was necessary to teach me that within the context of Misas Bezdin, of Misas Sreifa, we do not burn someone who's condemned for Sreifa on Shabbos. And the mitzvah of Misas Bezdin, Behumas HaMeis, does not override the Shabbos. And again, we're talking about burning according to Rabbi Yossi. So the Sreifa is a violation of Allah. That even though, as a universal rule, Esei Dochalos Aseh, but nevertheless, with regard to Vahumas, the essay of putting someone who's condemned to death through Sreifa does not override the Shabbos. Even though, in this case, we're talking about a lav of Shabbos, which does not involve Kares, because Sreifa, according to Rabbi Yossi, is only a lav. So the Gemara now rejects this. V'tehevi nami Rabbi Yossi, even if I agree with you that Tana Debei Rabbi Shmuel might reflect the Shita Rabbi Yossi. However, here, even Rabbi Yossi would agree that we're dealing with a Chiyuv Kares and a full-fledged Malacha Doraisa. When we put someone to death through Sreifa, there's more than just the Sreifa. Why? Because we have to burn the lead. Amar di Omar Rabbi Yossi Havar Lelav Yotzes. When are we talking about a lav? In the case of Havar, that's only Havar Great Dasa, when there's only burning involved. However, in our case of putting a person to death who's condemned for Sreifa, there's another malach involved, and that's Bishul. Havar de Bezdin Bishul Psilahu. They take the lead, and the lead is a psila, and they literally cook it. They put it into a hot cauldron, and they turn on the fire underneath it. And therefore, it's not just Havara, but in order to see to it that the oferes is a liquid molten that can be poured down someone's throat who's chayiv misa sreifa, they have to be maticha, what's called, which means they have to put the fire underneath it and cook it. And that's a cooking process. Now, you might say, well, cooking only applies to food. The Omar Rav Sheshes tells you that Mavashal Psila Shel Oferes, he incurs a chiyuv Moleches Bishul, because Mali Bishul Psila, Mali Bishul Samamonim. We learn and derive the 39 categories of labor on Shabbos from Moleches HaMishkan. And Moleches HaMishkan, they were Mavashal Samamonim, in order to extract the dye. And Rab Sheshes equates Bishul Psila with Bishul Samamonim. And Bishul Psila, in the process of Misa Sreifa, is no less of a malacha than Bishul of Samamonim. And therefore, if not for the miut that the Torah excludes the mitzvah of a Humas HaMeis on Shabbos, and we push off that mitzvah, even though in the Havamina we would override Shabbos with a malacha bishul, which is a malacha of kares and skila, and that's for the sake of the mitzvah's essay of Sreifas Bezdin. So once again, we have a clear-cut proof that essay dochalos sheyesh bo kares, and the exception to the rule is derived from a special limud that Misas Bezdin and Sreifa with the Bishul involved does not override the Shabbos, but as a universal rule, we would override the Shabbos. And now the Gemara rejects this proof. Omer Av Shimi Bar Ashi, Hi Tana, this Tana the Be'er Shmuel, Lo Mishum Di Asi Ese V'Dochi Lo Saseh. The reason why he needs a posel is not because he holds that an essay could override a Lo Saseh Sheish Bo Kares, Ela Mishum De Maisi Mikal V'Chomer. He has an entirely different approach, an entirely different logic that compels him, Rabbi Shmuel, to derive the conclusion that Misa's president of Sreifa would override the Shabbos. And that's a Kal V'Chomer. So we're no longer dealing with the principle of Esei Docha Losas, according to Rav Shimi Barashi, but rather the reason why we would violate the Shabbos for the sake of Sreifa and Misa's Bezdin is because of a Kal V'Chomer. V'hachi Kamar. And here's how we should interpret Rabbi Shmuel. When do we say that you violate the Shabbos? And that's a severe violation. That's only Shar Malachos. Chutz, but the exception is Misa's Bezdin. Avol Misa's Bezdin, Dachir Shabbos. But for the sake of Sreifa, in someone who's condemned to death, in order to fulfill the mitzvah of a Humas HaMes, we would override the Shabbos. And why? Mikal V'Chomer. We're going to derive a Kal V'Chomer. This Kal V'Chomer is all based on Avoda, the Avoda of the Kohanim in the Mikdash. And we're going to place on the scale the Avoda of the Kohanim versus Shabbos. Which is greater, the Avoda or the Shabbos? Which trumps which? And now we begin our daf for today, daf Zayin. Ma avoda shichamur v'docha Shabbos. When you put these two things on the scale, on the one side, the avoda sakarbonos, on the other side, Shabbos, we will override the Shabbos for the sake of avoda. So on the hierarchy, the scale, we put avoda above Shabbos. Shabbos is below avoda. And whatever is necessary for a korban tzibur on Shabbos, like for example the korban tamid, will override the Shabbos. So therefore, avoda is above Shabbos. That's point number one. Now we want to see what's more chamor and overrides avoda, because if we can identify something that overrides the avoda, then kolshke, now much more so, will override the Shabbos. And ritzicha, meaning the onesh, the punishment for a rotzeach, which is going to be a death penalty, docha osa, it overrides the avoda, which means, this is the mi'im mizbechi, that if a Kohen was guilty of murder, then even if he's the only last Kohen available in the Mikdash to do the avoda of the karbanos, I'm talking about the avoda of a karban tzibur, nevertheless, Bezdin will not allow this Kohen, who's chayav misa as a rotzeach, to complete the avoda. They will schlep him away from the mizbeach. And even if the Kohen is involved in the avodah of a karban tzibur, and even if there's no other Kohen available, they will take him out from the mizbeach in order to put him to death as a rotzeach, and the avodah will be b'teila. No one will do the avodah. Shenemar, we derive this from a pasuk in Shmos Chaf Aleph. It says, Ki yazid ish al re'eu lahar gov yarmo. If a person is guilty of a deliberate murder, we take him from the mizbeach. And that means even in a case where the Kohen who's guilty of ritzicha is involved in the avodah of a karban tzibur, we will nevertheless take him from mizbechi. The word mizbechi is interpreted by Chazal to mean mizbeach hamiyuchadli. And that's the karban tamid, which is considered the most important primary of all karbanos. This is all based on Rashi in Masechet Sanhedrin Lamed Vav. that the Karban Tamid is the karma. And the Torah says about Mizbechi, referring to the Karban Tamid, Me'im, Mizbechi tikachenu lamus. So it comes out that the avodah, the Karban Tamid, which is more chomer than Shabbos because it overrides the Shabbos, and yet, for the sake of putting to death the Rotzeach, we will override the Karban Tamid. Is Shabbos shenidches mipnei avodah? For the sake of a Karban Tzibur, we will override the Shabbos. So you see that Shabbos is relatively kala with a kuf min avodah. And now, for the sake of Ritzicha, we will be Mavatel Avodah. So you see that Ritzicha, putting to death, he who's condemned as a murderer to death, overrides and is more chomer than Avodah. And therefore, we would think, based on this Kal V'chomer, that we would override the Shabbos for the sake of someone who's condemned to death, to put him to death, even if it would be involved in a Malacha D'Oraisa Bishul. And therefore, Tana Debei Rabbi Shmuel, according to this new interpretation of Shimi, requires the Pasuk Moshvo Seichem to teach me, from which we derive that Misas Bezdin does not override the Shabbos. But obviously this has nothing to do with Esei Docha Losasa. So we cannot prove from Tana Debei Rabbi Shmuel anything about Esei Docha Losasa. Now, at this point in the Gemara is going to go back to the Brisa on Daf Vav Amud Beis. So let's just take a quick peek back on Daf Vav Amud Beis to the Brisa. Now, Daf Vav Amud Beis has a vertical line and then a horizontal line, like an L shape. So if we'll count up from the thin lines at the bottom of the thin lines, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The first word in the line is chutz. And there it says, O Eino el afilu misas bezdin. Umani mekayim v'humas bechol v'lo b'Shabbos. And then once again, the Brisa backtracks, O Eino el afilu b'Shabbos. So now we're embarking on a sugya that's going to analyze the shakla v'taya, the give and take of this Brisa. What's the O Eino? Which means that we're going to reject this concept that Misas Bezdin will override the Shabbos. The mitzvah of Humas only applies during the weekday, not on Shabbos. And then O'Eno, then we go back to the original position of Afilu b'Shabbos. What was the logic back and forth? Umay O'Eno Dika Omar. What is the O'Eno of the Brisa? That even Misas Bezdin is Asura b'Shabbos, it doesn't override the Shabbos. In other words, even though we have a Kal V'chomer that compelled us to the conclusion that Misas Bezdin would certainly override the Shabbos because it overrides Avodah, which overrides the Shabbos. Nevertheless, we're going to reject that Kal V'chomer with this O'Eno. So the Gemara wants to know, what's the O'Eno? What's the Pircha on the Kal V'chomer? So the Gemara explains, Hachi Kamar, this is what the Brisa has in mind. That despite the Kal V'chomer, we have a Pircha on the Kal V'chomer. And that's called Kvuras Mes Mitzvah Tochia. The word about Kvuras Mes Mitzvah, we're talking about a mess, a body that is found baderech, or in a city that's mostly non-Jewish and there's no one to bury the corpse. And from the place it's found, he cannot call out to anyone. If he screams, with a foghorn, no one will hear him to help him bury the dead. So he has a special mitzvah of Kvuras Mes Mitzvah. Tochiach. It is more chomer than Misas Bezdin, and it's docha the avoda, the Eino dochas haShabbos. And despite the fact that it's more chomer than Misas Bezdin, and it overrides avoda, as we'll soon see. Nevertheless, it's not doches HaShabbos. And that's a pirchan al kal v'chomer, because we assume that anything that's doches avoda, ipso facto, is doches HaShabbos, and yet kvuras mes mitzvah, even though it's doches HaShabbos, is doches avoda, it's not doches HaShabbos. And then the Brisa continues and rejects that. Oh, eino ela filu b'Shabbos. We will put him to death. He who's condemned to death, even on Shabbos, even though we had a pircha from Mes Mitzvah. Hadar Omar, what does it mean, the O Eino El Afilu B'Shabbos, and we reject the pircha of Mes Mitzvah? Is Kfuras Mes Mitzvah Tidche Shabbos Mikal V'Chomer. We're going to apply the same Kal V'Chomer that we applied to Misas Bezdin to Kfuras HaMes. And we should be Docha Shabbos in the logic of the Kal V'Chomer. Ma'avoda she Docha Shabbos. Nevertheless, Kfuras Mes Mitzvah Dochosa. We know that Kfuras Mes, and we're going to derive it now from a pasuk in Nazir, overrides Avoda. So let's say, for example, you're on your way to Avoda, and yet there's a mess, and no one's there to bury the mess. You will bury the mess, even though it will mean bittul avoda. You'll become tamei. You won't be able to do the avoda, but nevertheless, kfuras mes overrides avoda, even the Korban Pesach. And how do we know that kfuras mes is docha avoda? From an extra word in the parsha of Nazir. So we're in Parshas Naso, in Sefer Bamidbar, and there the Torah says, "Taper bnei Yisrael martalem isha ichaki afli lidor neder nazir lahasil Hashem kol yemei nizro Hashem kol yemei hiziro Hashem al nefesh meis lo yovo li'ovdu li'imo lachoso li'achiv lachoso li'itame behem." So it says al nefesh meis lo yovo. It's hakol bechlal. It's a general rule, no exceptions. Why did he have to say li aviv uleimo ulachoso lo yitame behen? So we're going to derive from the word aviv that even though he's not mitami lo aviv, but the nazir is mitami lemes mitzvah, and imo is coming to be marba that even if he's a nazir and a kohen, and he's certainly not mitami le imo, but he's mitami lemes mitzvah, and achiv comes to be marba that even if he's a nazir and a kohen gadol, nevertheless he should be mitame lemes mitzvah. Now the Bryce is interpreting the word lachoso, which is redundant, that it's marba even if he's a nazir, kohen gadol, he's on his way to shech the Korban Pesach or to circumcise his son, and certainly he's not mitame lachoso, but he's mitame lemes mitzvah. So therefore, we see clearly that Kvuras Mes Mitzvah overrides Avoda. He's on his way to the Korban Pesach, but yet he's Metame for the purpose of bearing a Mes Mitzvah. And we know that Avoda overrides the Shabbos. Is Shabbos Shenidcha B'nei Avoda, ain't no din should take Kvuras Mes Mitzvah, Doches HaShabbos, Dochosa. Why? Because since Avoda overrides Shabbos, and yet Mes Mitzvah overrides Avoda, certainly Mes Mitzvah would override the Shabbos. Talmud Loma Lo Savaro Eish B'chol Moshe Sechem B'Yom Shabbos, which teaches us that neither will Misas Bezdin override the Shabbos, nor will Kvuras HaMes override the Shabbos, even though it's a Mes Mitzvah. So L'chora, if we wanted to derive from this Kal V'chomer, and we have a pircha to say that Misas Bezdin Tochiach, that's Dochas Avodah and Dochas HaShabbos. So now the Gemara analyzes the different studim in this brisa, going this way, going that way, according to the Havamina of the brisa, that Esi Dochalosa says Sheish Mokaris. Ulamai the Salke Daitach of Meikara. Before we had the reinterpretation of Rav Shimi Bar Ashi, we thought that we need the pasuk to teach me that although in general essay docha losa sheyesh bo kares, but the exception is the case of misas bezdin, is my oeno dika omar. What was the oeno ela filu misas bezdin? That the Tana said that it would not be docha Shabbos. Why wouldn't it be docha Shabbos? If you're telling me that essay docha losa afilu essay sheish bo kares, afilu losa sheish bo kares. So what was the eno inyan? I should say o eno, not eno inyan. I added the next word. Achi kamar. When it says in the pasuk, v'chiyah b'ish chet mishpat movis behumas, I would assume that means we have to put him to death, whether it's chol or whether it's Shabbos money. Avol misas bezdin dochi Shabbos, and why the osiyase v'dochi losase? So why did the Bryson then backtrack? Oh, eno hodar omar emer damirin esi dochi losase. That's only losa greda, a classic losase. But losase sheyesh bo kares. We never heard anywhere that an essay could be docha losa sheish bo kares, such a severe losa, and therefore we don't need the miyut in the pasuk, because misvaro we would know that misas bezdin, which is an essay, would not be docha losa of Shabbos because of losa sheish bo kares. Hadar Omar. Now the Brisa goes back and say, O eno ela filu b'Shabbos, meaning that Bezdin would put to death that person that was condemned to death even on Shabbos. And that means that we have halacha b'yadenu. There's a tradition that esei dochalosa she'ein bo kares. And now the Gemara is analyzing the O'eno Afilu B'Shabbos, that if essay overrides a losaseh, then let it be a losa sheish bo kares. What's the difference? The gap, the discrepancy between losaseh and losa sheish bo kares is very minor, and it's not significant. Otu asay dochas losaseh, lav losaseh chomer minei. You have to admit to me that if you were comparing on a scale, weighing an essay and a losa, says certainly a losa is more severe than an essay. A losa says bekum v'aseh and generates a chiyuv onesh of malchus. An essay is b'shevi alta, so there's no punishment for violating an essay. And yet we have a principle of v'ka'asi aseh v'dochi le. The principle is machadish, a great revolution that's not intuitively logical, namely that an essay does override a losasa. It's therefore mali chumer zutra, mali chumer rabba. What things to make, whether it's a lotas she'ein bo kares or even a lotas which is more chomer that has kares. In both cases, we would say that an essay is so powerful that it overrides a losasa. Mali chumer zutra, mali chumer rabba. To teach me that misas bezdin is not docha Shabbos, even though as a universal rule, an essay would be docha losas sheish bo kares. However, again, that's only the havamina, but lamaskana, the Brisa is interpreted in the light of Rav Shimi Barashi, that the pasuk is kavi lafuki, the kal v'chomer, excuse me, the kal v'chomer from avoda. And we're not going to say that since misas bezdin is docha avoda, that's derived from the pasuk me'im bizbachit tikachet lamus. Therefore, certainly the kal v'chomer should be docha Shabbos, even though Shabbos is a losa sheish bo kares, but it's less chomer than avoda. The avoda is docha Shabbos, and misas bezdin is docha the avoda. So now we're back to square one. We still don't understand what justifies the drush of Oleh. In the case of an achos isha that fell for yibum, what was the svara to say that it would be docha an iser kares? Achos Ishto is a chi of kares, and Erva Sheish Bo Kares. Why would the mitzvah of Yibum have the power to override a lotus of Sheish Bo Kares? L'maskana. So the Gemara tries its hand at a new analysis here based on one of the Midos HaTorah Nidreshes plan, which is called Davar Shaya B'chlal V'yotzim Nechlal Lo Lamed Al Atzmo Lotza El Lamed Al Klal Kuli Yotz. El Yitzrich, why do we need Oleh? What was the Havamina to think that in the case of Achos Isha, which is a Chi of Karetz, the essay of Yibum would override the Isha Karetz? Al Kedai T'chamina to heavy high Eishes Ach. Okay, now we go to Eishes Ach. Eishes Ach, by definition, is always overridden by the mitzvah of Yibum. Eishes Ach is a Chiyuv Karetz. All the arayos, ukshu la'adadi, are all equal in the eyes of the Torah. And if the erva of Eishes Ach is trumped by the mitzvah of Yibum, then all arayos should be trumped by the mitzvah saseh of Yibum. The heavy high Eishes Ach, Davar Shaya B'chlal, Yotzim in a Chlal. Right, the Klal is the Kol Shayasam Mikol Tovev Yoseilu V'Nichus and Afosh Sosus Mikerev Amam, and Eishes Ach is included. But Yotzim in a Klal, in the case of Yibum, L'Lamed, to teach us Lo L'Lamed Al Atzmo Yotza El L'Lamed Al Klal Kula Yotza. Whatever was included in the Klal is now taken out of the Klal for the sake of the mitzvah of Yibum. Once we take out one erva from the Klal, from the bag, namely Eishes Ach, which is by definition what Yibum is all about, that's not just teaching you something about Eishes Ach, but it sheds a light on all the arayos that were included in the entire Klal. And the Torah is telling you now that there's no Iser erva b'makom Yibum. And that's a midah shatorah nidreshes for him. And therefore, in the absence of a leah, we would have assumed that in the case of Achos Ishto, and for that matter, the balance of all arayos, we would override and trump the arayos for the sake of the mitzvah of Yibum. And that we derive from Eishes Ach. Kedesanya, now the Gemara wants to prove that there is such a midah shatorah nidreshes for him, of something that was in the klal, was taken out of the klal, in order to reveal something about the entire klal and all the memberships therein. The Sanya, we learned in a Brisa of Rabbi Yishmael, Dover Shaya B'chlal V'yotzim in a klal. Lo l'lamed al atzmi yotza, l'lamed al klal kuli yotza. Ketza. Now we're learning a pasuk in Vayikra Perek Zayin, and we're going to compare it to a pasuk in Vayikra Perek Chaf Beis. V'nefesh asher tochal basar mizevach hashlomo shel Hashem v'tumas ha'olav v'nichnas ha'nefesh ha'hi me'amel. So the Torah specifies shlomim with regard to a person who's tamei and he eats basar kosher, and for that he incurs a chi of karetz. So the Gemara asks, "Lo shlomim b'chlal kosher mayu?" If we fast forward to Perek Chaf Beis in Sefer Vayikra, the Torah says, "Kol ish asher yikra mikol zarechem al hakadoshim, asher yakdishu b'nei Yisrael Hashem v'tumas ha'olav v'nichras ha'nefesh ha'hi milafanav." Meaning, if a person eats kachim and he's tamei, he's chayav karetz, and shlomim is included in kachim. So why did the Torah have to specify shlomim? Lama yatsu. Why is a special parsha of shlomim with regard to a tamei who's chayav karetz for achila b'tumah? Yishaleim v'lo malacha ma shlomim yuchadim kachim mizbeach af kol kachim mizbeach natsu kachim perek habayis. Shlomim is kachim mizbeach, but if a person is magdish something for the purpose of the Beis Hamikdash, that's called Kedushas Beis Perek Habayis. The chi of kares for eating kachim b'tumah is limited to the paradigm case of Shlomim, which is Kodshim Mizbeach. And of course, all Kodshim are derived from Shlomim, or equal to Shlomim, and the Torah says you have cars for eating them betumah. But this comes to exclude Kodshim Mizbeach. Kodshei Berek Habayis, because Kodshei Berek Habayis, if you eat them betumah, for example, let's say a person takes a foodstuff and he designates it for the Beis HaMikdash, meaning for Berek Habayis, otherwise known in our language as Kedushas Damim. If he eats it betumah, he's not chayiv kares. It's not dumya to Shlomim, which is Kodshim Mizbeach. So Hachinami, using the same model, will apply it to Eishes Ach. Shebechlal kol arayis av yotzis yotzis lahakishay leho lecho loma lecho ma Eishes Ach sharia af kol arayis nari sharia. The Torah was matir Eishes Ach in the case of Yibum, and so too the Torah would be matir all of the arayis in the case of Yibum, if not for the fact that we derive from Oleh to teach us that only Eishes Ach is overridden in the mitzvah of Yibum, but not other arayos. Okay. Now, let's take a little bit of time to analyze this analogy of the Gemara. In the case of Shlomim, our problem was we already have a general Issa that applies to all Kodshim, and now the Torah specifies the Issa in the case of Shlomim. So that's called Lahakish V'lo Melacha, etc. Lo B'yotz. But in the case of Eishes Ach, which was included in all the Arayos, the Torah took it out of the klal of Issa Arayos to be matir. Me dummy, says the Gemara. There's no fair analogy between the heter of Eishes Ach and Yibum and the Isur of Achilas Kodshim B'tumah. Chasam, in the case of Kodshim, in the case of Shlomim, klal B'Isur. The klal that the Torah prohibited a Tameh from eating Kodshim, all Kodshim, was L'Isur. And Prat, as well, the Shlomim as a Prat is B'Isur. And if the Torah repeats the Isur a second time around, then we have to assume that Lo al Atzma Yotza, El Lamed al Kal Kuli Yotza. What's the exact language? Yeah, Lo Lamed al Atzma Yotza, Lamed al Kal Kuli Yotza. But Hacha, that's not analogous to our case of Shar Arayos and Ervas Eishes Ach, Klal Be'Isur, Uprat Beheter. If the Prat is taking something out of the Klal, it's antithetical to the Klal. Namely, the Klal was L'Isur to prohibit all Arayos, and the Yotzim in a Klal, the Prat, is to be Matir in the case of Yavam. That's only Malamed al Atzma, because it's being taken out of the klal. When you're repeating the klal, like for example, Shlomim repeating all the Isur, that applies to all Kodshim, then it's the Lamed al klal kuliyot. And it sheds a general light on the entire klal, which is going to tell you Kodshim is back, la fuke, to the exclusion of Kodshim Berek Habayis. But in the case of a heter, where the Torah took an Isur, which was included in the klal, and specified that one specific Isur from the klal, pulled it out of the klal in order to be matir it, that's Malamed al Atzmo Yotze. Only al Atzmo Bilvad. And I'll give you such an example of something that was in the klal and was Yotze l'klal for a new din, an antithetical din, and it's only Malamed al Atzmo Bilvad. Lo dami ella li, the following drasha that's explicit in the Brisa, and it says davar, meaning kol davar, Eishes Ach, Shahaya Bichlal. It was included in all our rights. The Yatzal Adam B'Davar Chadash, and the Torah gave a heter in the situation of Yibum. You can't apply the principle that sheds a light on the entire klal of all the arayas, unless the Torah is matir all arayas b'makom Yibum explicit. So therefore it comes out at this point in the sugya that we could not derive from Eishes Ach a heter for other arayos b'makom Yibum, and then we're back to our original kasha. Why do we need the miyut of Alea to teach me that the Isser of Shar arayos is not trumped in the case of Yibum? Okay. Now at this point, we're going to talk a little about what's called Asham Mitzorah. The Mitzorah brings on the 8th day of his Tara no less than 3 karbanos, one of which we're going to focus our attention on. He brings, number 1, a keves liola, number 2, a keves liasham, and number 3, a female keves lechatos. And then there's an entire process of Tara after the karbanos are brought. The Kohen takes the dama asham and he places it on the right earlobe of the Mitzorah and on the Bahonos Yado V'Raglav Hayaminim, and the Mitzorah brings a Luk Shemen, and from that Luk Shemen, the Kohen does 7 times L'fnei Hashem. He does a kind of a, we'll call it a hazah, we'll use that word. And then from the rest of the shemen that's left, he puts it on the earlobe and the bahonos of Yoda V'Raglav on the right side and on his head. In any event, we have a brisa in Rabbi Yishmael. Dover shahaya b'chlal, b'yatza lidon b'dover chadash, so that which is taken out of the klal is limited to that specific case, and it doesn't shed a light on anything else that was in the original klal. Ketzad. And now we're going to focus our attention on keves ha'asham of Mitzorah and Taras HaMitzorah. This is all in Perik Yudalid of Sefer Vayikra. V'shachat es hakeves b'makom asher yishchat es hachatos v'esolah b'makom hakodesh ki chatos ha'asham hu l'kohen. And the brisa of Rabbi Yishmael is going to point out that there's something superfluous here in this pasuk. When the Torah tells us that the shechita, the keves, should be in the same location as the shechita of the chatos and the olah. Ein Talmud lomar kachatos ha'asham. We don't need the pasuk to tell me ki kechatos ha'asham. Those words are redundant. Why? Because assuming it's teaching me that the place for the shechita, the location of the shechita of the asham, of the keves liasham, is the same identical location as the shechita of a chatos, which means tzfon hazara. We already know this from another pasuk. V'shachet es hakeves b'makom asher yishchat es hachatos. So why do you have to tell me ki kachatos ha'asham hu l'kohen? You're equating the asham with the chatos, and you're telling me what? The location has to be b'tzafa on hazara. I already know that because the pasuk says earlier, shachatos hakeves b'makom asher yishchat es hachatos, which is the tzfon hazara. Now you could argue that it's coming to teach me the din of matan domo ala mizbeach, and achilaso shala asham. But that's impossible as well, because the din is equivalent to all hashamos that require matan damim lemizbeach and are eaten in the azar to zichrei kahuna yom v'layla. Asham mitzvah is no different than all the other korbanos asham, and shares the same dinim of matan damim, of achila ba'azara, zichrei kahuna yom v'layla. So therefore, we're stuck once again with the words "Matam aloma kechatas ha'asham." What is that coming to teach me? It cannot be coming to teach me the makom of shchita, because that we know from the beginning of the pasuk. It cannot be coming to teach me about the dinim of matan damim or the achila, etc., because that's part of all hashamos and has the same identical din of matan damim l'mizbeach of all hashamos. So finally, let's come to grips with it. We have two words in the pasuk that are written. What are they teaching us? Kechatos ha'asham. Lefi sheyatza asham mitzora. Asham mitzora was taken out of the general package, the general bag of all hashamos. Lidon b'davar shchadash. We find something regarding to Hasham mitzora that doesn't apply for any of the other hashamos. And what is that? B'nesinas domo al boen yodo uboen regel hayemonis. The din of nesinas dam al abahanos is unique to the Hasham mitzora, when he's coming to purify himself. It doesn't apply to any one of the other hashamos. In all the cases of hashamos, all of them, with the exception of mitzora, the dam of the carbon is sprinkled on the mizbeach. There's no sprinkling nesinas dam al boy yada. Is therefore yochol. Maybe I would think that lo yehiton matan domim ve'murim l'gavim mizbeach. How far can we go with this? Maybe when the Torah is obligating the mitzvah of nesinas domo al bahanos, maybe it's coming lafuki to exclude the law of matan domim. And for that matter, meaning matan domim on the mizbeach, and for that matter, replaces the din of emurim, meaning chalav v'evarim, with regard to the mizbeach. So we're taking Hasham mitzora out of the bag of all the other hashamos completely and totally. And it's teaching me a brand new din. That's called lidon b'davar chadash. And it would not require matan damim and a murim of chalavim ve'varim legavim mizbeach, like all other hashamos. And that's called ladun b'davar chadash.